Hello everyone! When you think of the best video game water, you probably think of Sea of Thieves. It might surprise you to hear that their water looks so good because it is a genuine simulation of the ocean. It might also surprise you to hear that Sea of Thieves didn't do it first. In fact, Assassin's Creed Black Flag and Crysis both notably made use of the same techniques as Sea of Thieves, and even the movie Titanic did it for their ocean CGI. So how did they do it? And can I do any better? Before we get started, this video heavily builds on topics presented in my last video, so you should go watch that and come back. But if you don't want to, here's a quick recap. We finished the last video with a bunch of fractionally summed up sine waves that happens to look like the surface of moving water. My GPU can handle around 64 waves directly in the water shader itself without using too many resources, which is plenty of waves for a small body of water. But when we wanted to model something like the ocean, we could not have a detailed water surface without a lot of tiling, which breaks the illusion. Many people offered their own solutions, such as using noise to prevent repetition, but noise is too expensive to compute in real time, and you would instead use a noise texture, which itself has to tile across the ocean and will repeat just like everything else. The reality is that mostly everything in real time is going to repeat eventually, so we need to shift our goal from having no tiling to tiling just enough that it's not very noticeable. This is easily measured by reducing the tiling in the field of view rather than reducing the tiling from above, because you'll always be able to see it from far enough away anyways. Since the FOV is now involved, we have the option of creating some sort of complex level of detail system where we have multiple sets of waves that are chosen based on the distance from the camera. That way there is more visual variety in the distance, and the discontinuity in the waves wouldn't be noticeable. That sounds like a lot more work though, so I think I'll just go with the much simpler solution, which is throwing more waves at the water. To reframe our problem, we can't have our cake and eat it too. The more space we ask our waves to cover, the more waves we need to fill in the gaps and get those fine details back. This has a computational limit. The GPU can only handle so many waves. For me, the limit is 650 waves before the FPS dips below 60. This means that if we dedicated all of our GPU's resources to water, we would only have 650 waves to work with, which still tiles almost immediately. At this point, a normal person would probably give up and go down the other path of wave cascading, but if I gave up, then I wouldn't be able to tell you that the water I showed at the beginning of the video is 4.2 million waves at 150 FPS. To understand how this could even remotely be possible, let's think about our water in reverse. Imagine the surface of our water is described by some unknown periodic function. We could then say that the sum of every trig function in our fluid simulation is an approximation of that water surface function. A series of trig functions that approximates a periodic function is called a Fourier series, but that's a bit of an oversimplification. Taking a signal and decomposing it into all of the frequencies that went into it is known as the Fourier transform, and if math were the D&D magic system, the Fourier transform would be a level 9 spell. To understand just how magical it is, it's like if you took a piece of matter and decomposed it into a representation of all the molecules that went into it. You can then do whatever you want with the molecules, because the actual magical part of the Fourier transform is that you can go back. The inverse Fourier transform takes the frequency representation of a function and converts it back into the original function. This is a lossless transformation, so you can go back and forth forever as much as you want, and everything stays preserved. This symbolically means that if you put a little too much salt in your pasta, you could decompose your pasta, get rid of some of the sodium, and convert it back into the pasta. A more real-world application would be if you had a sample wave of a piano chord. You could take the Fourier transform and decompose that wave into all the frequencies that went into it. With that, we'd be able to tell what keys were used to make the sound. You could then chop off one of the key's frequencies and take the inverse Fourier transform to turn the frequencies back into the original music wave, but now without one of those keys. There are a ton of amazing resources on the Fourier transform for you to appreciate and admire that I will link in the description, but the core concept that makes it all work is complex numbers, and if you aren't familiar with complex numbers, then I'd love to tell you about a free and easy way to get introduced to them with this video's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is the best way to learn math, data science, and computer science interactively. Brilliant offers thousands of lessons from basic to advanced, so if you're just getting started learning math or are brushing up on your linear algebra for shader programming, Brilliant has something for you. Even if you don't know where to start, that's no problem. Brilliant customizes its content to fit what you need. Just take a quick quiz when you sign up, and Brilliant will match you with lessons that fit your interests and level of expertise. In the past 2 weeks, I had to learn everything everything I needed for this video, and Brilliant gave me the perfect jumpstart on complex numbers to better understand how the Fourier transform was actually working. You can even immediately apply this knowledge to create beautiful fractal shaders. Be sure to try out everything Brilliant has to offer with a free 30-day trial and 20% off an annual plan when you visit brilliant.org/Acerola or click the link in the description. Thanks so much to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Okay, so the Fourier transform takes a function and decomposes it into all of the individual waves that went into it, while the inverse Fourier transform takes all of those waves and turns it back into the original function. For our water, we are interested in that inverse functionality, taking a lot of frequencies and turning it into the ocean. But before we can do that, we must come to terms with two important concepts, the time domain and the frequency domain. The time domain representation of a wave is how you would normally think about it. The x-axis is time, and so it describes the amplitude of the wave as time moves forward. In the context of our water, this would be the height of a vertex at any given time t. The frequency domain, on the other hand, represents the wave with frequency on the x-axis. Instead of inputting a time, we input a frequency, and it tells us what the amplitude is for that frequency. Remember that the frequency of a wave is the distance between its peaks, and the amplitude is how tall the peak is. For a simple sine wave with frequency and amplitude 1, the time domain graph is what you're used to, but the frequency domain graph is going to be a flat line with a single point at 1, 1. This is because at frequency 1, the amplitude is 1, but at all other frequencies, the amplitude is 0. But if we added a sine wave with frequency 2 and amplitude 2, the time domain graph would change meaningfully, and the frequency domain graph would have a new point at 2, 2. Thinking back to our very complex fractional Brownian motion sum of sines, the time domain graph is crazy, but the frequency domain graph would actually be quite simple, since our waves start with amplitude 1 and exponentially decrease as frequency increases. This frequency domain graph is also referred to as the spectrum of our water, and we reference it as h hat. So, if such a simple function can generate such a complex looking fluid simulation, the logic would track that if we got a little bit more sophisticated, we could probably model a very convincing ocean. As it turns out, this is exactly what Jerry Tessendorf presented in his 2004 paper, Simulating Ocean Water. In this paper, Tessendorf explains methods used by several movies for water CGI, like Waterworld and Titanic.
Skip. But when does this game get fucking good?
Tessendorf states that oceanographic literature tends to downplay Gerstner waves as a realistic model of the ocean, so just know that my opinion of Gerstner waves in the last video is now backed by the oceanographic literature. Moving on, Tessendorf informs us that oceanographers have basically done all of the work for us. With data taken from buoys, photographs, and radar measurements, researchers have defined several spectrum functions that can encapsulate all the possible frequencies and their corresponding amplitudes present in a fully developed sea. We define a fully developed sea as a sea produced by winds blowing steadily over hundreds of miles for several days. Tessendorf makes use of the Phillips spectrum, which takes a single parameter as the wind speed. The greater the wind speed, the greater the largest possible wave. As far as I'm aware, Sea of Thieves also makes use of the Phillips spectrum. It turns out the Phillips spectrum kind of sucks. The developers of Atlas in their GDC talk presented their experience with the Phillips spectrum and instead proposed the use of the JOHN-SWAP spectrum. JOHN-SWAP stands for Joint North Sea Wave Observation Project and has a lot more control over the state of the ocean, such as wind speed, wind direction, wind fetch, the peak of the spectrum, directional distribution, an artistic amplitude override, and a low-pass filter all built in. So it's basically better in like every conceivable fashion. Our goal is now to build a random ocean wave height field directly in the frequency domain by randomly sampling our spectrum function and storing it into a texture. This sounds complicated, but actually it just means generating two random numbers and multiplying it with the JOHN-SWAP at every pixel of the texture. An example output looks like so. We've only looked at one-dimensional spectrums, so how do we interpret this two-dimensional spectrum? The origin is in the center of the texture, the pixel value is the amplitude, and the distance from the origin is the frequency. The direction of the pixel from the origin is going to be the direction of the wave. Notice how this logic sort of lines up with our observations in the last video, where we wanted our lower frequency waves to be tall and our higher frequency waves to be very short, to get fine details without the chaos. While we used fractional Brownian motion to fix that last time by iteratively reducing our amplitude as frequency increased, we are now instead generating a legitimate oceanographic spectrum derived from real-world observational data that is capable of realistically simulating every possible kind of ocean state we'd like. But in order to actually actually see the state of the ocean, we have to do one final task, which is apply the inverse Fourier transform to convert our frequency domain representation of the ocean to the time domain. Despite how scary the Fourier transform seems, it's actually very simple and elegant. To generate a height map from our spectrum texture, we just sum up every single frequency in the spectrum for each pixel of our height map, just like the sum of sines. Here, vector k is the position in the spectrum texture, and vector x is the current position in the height map that we are summing everything up for. Then, for our partial derivatives to calculate these surface normals, we just do another Fourier transform. This is now a context in which it would actually be a great idea to do central difference normals, as I presented in the last video, because a Fourier transform is going to be much more expensive. But in favor of having the best visuals possible, I will be doing the extra Fourier transforms for exact normal vectors. The result of our sums is then what we expect, a height map with partial derivatives. Since we are no longer doing the water logic directly in the vertex and fragment shader, and the data is stored in textures, all our water shader needs to do is sample the height map at each vertex and the slope map at each fragment, and we have our ocean. Mr. Rolla, why isn't it moving? What a great question. That's because we forgot the time part of the time domain conversion. I lied to you moments ago. The Fourier transform is not simple. It's actually quite complex. The frequency representation of a function has a second complex part to it. You should think of it like a vector, where the first component is a real number, and the second component points into the complex plane. Earlier I said we generate two numbers to sample our spectrum function, because we want a random real value and a random complex value. It's this complex part of the frequency domain that defines the phase. If you recall from last video, the phase of a wave is what moves the wave forward. To then move our ocean forward through time, we need to evolve our frequencies every frame by multiplying h hat with Euler's formula. Despite its simple appearance, this formula is basically God. Richard Feynman himself said that Euler's formula is the most remarkable formula in mathematics. This is because this simple complex exponential function is equivalent to these two trig functions, which when multiplied with our complex valued frequency is going to rotate it around into the complex plane, evolving our frequency up to the time we want. This is conceptually difficult to grasp, so it's easy to think about Euler's formula like a hand crank on a projector that is displaying our animated ocean. Although it's more like you are sitting in Plato's cave, the ocean is the projected shadow on the wall, and the complex plane is casting the shadows. We can control the speed of our ocean by multiplying time with a constant. In Tessendorf's paper, this is referred to as the dispersion relation, which is equivalent to the square root of the gravity constant times the magnitude of vector k. If you care about how this is derived from the Navier-Stokes equations, he explains that in the paper. With the immense power of Euler's formula and the Fourier transform, we are able to calculate the surface of the ocean at any point in time we want, which, if that's not cool to you, I don't know what is. This means you could probably make a game with some sick time manipulation mechanics, but generally, we're just gonna move time forward like normal people. Wow, look at that beautiful water. Let's check the performance. Oh my god. At the moment, we are doing a 256 by 256 simulation, which is 65,000 waves, and it's taking almost 40 milliseconds. This is of course unacceptable for real-time rendering, so we have to diagnose the problem. Thankfully, the problem is quite obvious. Earlier when I explained how the inverse Fourier transform works, it's clearly an n-squared algorithm and is going to be extremely slow for high values of n. This is the unfortunate reality of the basic discrete Fourier transform, or DFT for short. In order to make our ocean simulation fast enough for real time, we'll have to upgrade to the fast Fourier transform. So, how does the fast Fourier transform work? Look, sometimes we have to figure things out ourselves. So I just want to take this time to remind you that you're capable of achieving amazing things. Don't let self-doubt hold you back or obstacles discourage you. Every step you take, no matter how small, is a step forward. When you embrace challenges, your opportunities grow. I know that you've got the determination, the passion, and the strength within you to overcome anything. Believe in yourself and your journey. Keep pushing forward and keep shining brightly. With that in mind, another YouTuber by the name of Jump Trajectory provided me with their optimized FFT compute shader, which is based on NVIDIA Waveworks, so it's the real deal. Definitely check out their video for their own approach to topics presented in this video. The FFT is so important because its algorithmic complexity is n log n. Back in our project, the FFT has reduced the runtime from 40 milliseconds to practically nothing. We can even go all the way up to a 1024 by 1024 simulation for just over a million waves and still have no issues with performance. Since we can do Fourier transforms like it's nothing now, the last thing Tessendorf tells us about ocean rendering is how to get choppier waves. If you look at the ocean with just height displacement, it looks kind of weird and the movement feels too linear. We'd like some horizontal displacement in addition to the vertical displacement. Thankfully, we can get the horizontal displacement vector with another FFT, and when we add it to our vertices, it makes a pretty big difference. Another amazing aspect of the fast Fourier transform is that the output is perfectly periodic outside its domain, meaning it tiles no matter what. I never mentioned it, but when you're working with the basic sum of sines, there are some frustrating limitations to get it to tile within a texture, which the FFT doesn't have issues with. Let's also take a quick moment to optimize our ocean mesh now that we're getting more performance intensive. When we're working with meshes this large with so many vertices out of camera view, we want to take advantage of GPU tessellation to cull triangles outside of view and dynamically increase the triangle resolution of triangles that are closer to the camera. This has tons of benefits. We will no longer waste resources on all the vertices that we can't see, and we can devote more resources to triangles that are closer to the camera and do less work in the distance. You can see the effect of the dynamic tessellation here. More triangles means a more accurate representation of our FFT displacement map. If you're interested in how this works in depth, check out my video on the subject. That's pretty much all there is to the ocean simulation side of things. With this, we now have the same animation logic as Sea of Thieves, but if we want our water to actually look as good, we'll have to upgrade our basic lighting model. Let's revisit our current light model. We have a constant ambient light, plus the diffuse reflectance, plus the specular reflectance, plus the indirect light from the environment reflections. Combined, this produces a decent looking water surface, mainly because of the environment reflections doing a lot of heavy lifting. Without them, we are left with the starter kit Blinfong lighting model that I presented in depth last video, which makes our water sort of look like plastic. In truth, this is because our lighting model has forgotten how light works. So let's go back to the drawing board. Diffuse reflectance is mainly for opaque materials, but as we all know, water is not opaque. It is a transparent volume. This means light rays do not immediately diffusely reflect off the surface. The rays will penetrate the water and scatter around, dispersing and losing energy. This is known as subsurface scattering. So let's drop the diffuse and replace it with a scatter term. This extremely abstract equation then describes the appearance of our water as the sum of inwardly scattered light, directly reflected light, and indirectly reflected light. With this as a baseline, we can now think critically about how we want to achieve this output with different rendering algorithms, because there's no exact way to go about it. If this was Blender or some other not real-time rendering context, we would just go with the most expensive algorithms for the best appearance. But working in real-time rendering is like you have $14.32 at a 5-star restaurant, and so you usually go with the free salad, but every few years, we get another dollar to work with. Like I mentioned earlier, subsurface scattering is a phenomenon in which light rays enter a material, bounce around, and then exit. This generally requires complex rendering techniques like ray marching and doing stuff like I talked about in my video on smoke rendering, but thankfully, in the context of the ocean, we can sort of fake it pretty easily. This is because the ocean is so huge that nearly all the light that enters it is going to never be seen again. The only time this isn't the case is when the sun is pointing at the water at a grazing angle, so then there's a high chance that light rays can bounce upwards, or when the wave peaks are high, so we can assume that less light is being absorbed through those wave peaks. The developers of Atlas were kind enough to show us their scattered light approximation, which is kind of just a bunch of bullshit, so let's piece it together. The first term is how much scattering occurs because of wave height. The second term is how visible the normal is to the camera. The third term is Lambert's cosine law, which we are now so familiar with, and the last term is an ambient light value. Each of these terms is multiplied with a scatter color, the sun color, and an ambient light color. The scatter color of real-life water is generally blue because water absorbs red and green wavelengths, resulting in scattered blue light. When combined, we get an approximation of subsurface scattering. It looks decently convincing because it blends the color of the sun based on the angle of incidence, which gives us the greenish-blue hues that we see in real-life water. Now that we've got our scatter term, we can think about the specular term. To improve this, we would upgrade from Blinfong to a more physically based approach, which I have done off-screen, and you can see the difference here. I initially planned on having a segment on physically based rendering, but it dragged on too long and I didn't like it, so instead I plan on releasing a separate video on the subject with Disney's principled BRDF, so please look forward to it. Lastly, I won't be making any improvements to the environment reflection part of our shader, so we can just tack those on. With our new and improved lighting model, the ocean is looking a lot more physically plausible and less like plastic when compared to our original surface shader. Did you think we were done? No. Unfortunately, there's still one major shader feature that's separating our water from Sea of Thieves. Here's an example video of Sea of Thieves water. Can you spot the major difference between their water and ours? That's right, the foam. Ocean foam is the secret sauce to making the ocean look cool and interesting and stylized. The developers of Sea of Thieves presented their own experience with stylizing water and found that any attempt to reduce the fine detail of the ocean simulation kinda made it look bad, so they chose to keep the water looking realistic and stylize the foam instead. Let's also take a moment to discern between sea foam and sea spray. Sea foam is going to stay on the surface of the water, while sea spray is going to be the particles that shoot off from breaking waves. For best visuals, we'd model both sea foam and sea spray, which is what Sea of Thieves does. But for my project, I will be cutting the sea spray because this video is already complicated enough and I don't want to add particle systems on top of it all because it's not a simple mechanism. Thankfully, sea foam is pretty simple, but what actually is it? Depending on the environment, sea foam is a mixture of decomposed organic matter and bubbles. The organic matter is going to build up and collect along the ocean currents and will be deposited somewhere eventually, and the bubbles will come from breaking waves where air is injected into the water. If we wanted a genuine ocean foam, we would need a much more sophisticated ocean simulation complete with currents and turbulent flow models which modern day math can barely handle. So let's bring our expectations down a bit. What we can detect is breaking waves where the bubbles would form. A breaking wave occurs when two large waves sort of collide with each other, causing the peak of the wave to literally break. In real life, this would result in sea spray and water particles shooting upwards, but in our simulation, the displacement vectors result in a wave peak that has curled in on itself. So, how do we detect this inward curling? With more math, of course. We can compute the Jacobian of our water displacement vectors in order to see where we need to draw foam. The Jacobian describes the uniqueness of a transformation, which kind of sounds like bullshit, but just go with it. If we look at a graph of the Jacobian against the graph of the water surface, we can see that the Jacobian goes negative where the wave peaks curl in on each other. So then it would seem that all we have to do is detect if the Jacobian is negative, and if so, we have foam. We can also very easily get more foam by biasing the Jacobian down so that we get more negative results. This already makes our water look more interesting, but to really sell it, we need to accumulate foam rather than draw it only where the Jacobian is negative. In order to do this, we need to keep track of our foam simulation over time by storing it in a texture. When the Jacobian of a point on the water goes negative, we add a little bit of foam into the texture, and every frame we apply an exponential decay function to the whole texture. This means that the parts of the water that are really turbulent are going to have a negative Jacobian for several frames, resulting in a lot of foam being injected into the foam texture. When the Jacobian is no longer negative in that space, then the decay function will slowly dissolve the foam, rather than the foam instantly disappearing. This gives the illusion of foam accumulating in busier areas of the water, which looks more correct. Working with the parameters is pretty difficult, and it can be hard to get the foam to look good, but when it's just right, then it really takes the shader home. Sea of Thieves employs a stylized foam texture, but I'm just using a flat color for the foam. After playing with it for a few hours, here's a little ocean scene I've come up with. Our ocean is finished! At this point, we have pretty much completely recreated Sea of Thieves water, just without sea spray and like that whole boat part. Wait, what's that? You can still see the tiling. Well, that's not good. The allegations are true. The tiling is still obvious, even with our new fancy tech. If you look into the distance diagonally, you can see the tiling pretty easily. The reality is that we still can't have our cake and eat it too. Even with a million waves, we can't cover a large enough distance while maintaining the finer details. So how do we solve this dilemma? Well, by baking more cakes, obviously. The FFT is so efficient that we can afford to simulate multiple ocean spectrums at the same time. If we had 4 simulations of differing scales tiles going in parallel, then we can layer them on top of each other with different tiling rates to mitigate the visual patterns. This will let us model giant rolling waves in addition to very small detail waves, and when it's all added together, we get the benefits of both, while also pretty much eliminating any visible tiling in the field of view. We also get really high quality foam due to the sheer density of the waves. With 4 1024 by 1024 simulations, we have over 4 million waves. The amount of detail on the water is so high that you can't even really see it in this video due to encoding limitations as well as YouTube compression. So, if you have a Windows machine and would like a build to look at, there's one posted on my Patreon. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can get access to these builds and vote on the next video topic. As usual, a huge thank you to all my current patrons. Without your support, I wouldn't be able to spend 20 hours a day reading esoteric research papers. At this point, you might be thinking, wow, Acerola, 4 million waves? No way that's real-time viable. On my 1660, the ocean simulation part of it all is taking about 6.6 milliseconds, which is 150 FPS. It is true that in practice, you definitely would not do 4 1024 by 1024 simulations and would instead do maybe 4 256 by 256 simulations. But if my mid-range GPU can handle 4 million waves, then it would be totally possible to have this level of quality available as a graphics setting for higher-end GPUs, because a 30 or 40 series would be able to tank this like it's nothing. And let's not forget where we came from either. The naive sum of sines had a hard limit of 650 waves on my GPU, but now, with the power of the fast Fourier transform and some adult mathematics, our water is now 650,000% more detailed and still runs almost 3 times as fast. Having multiple simulations at once also allows us to model pretty much any state of the ocean we could want, from huge, stormy, choppy waves to something much more calm and relaxing, yet still visually diverse and interesting. Here's a few different scenes I've put together. Unfortunately, there's about 100 parameters, so it's very time consuming to work with, but quite frankly, I can stare at this for hours anyways. If you'd like to see some more videos, you can find them on my Twitter. Well, that was a lot of stuff I had to learn and implement in about 2 weeks. While we have technically surpassed the quality of Sea of Thieves water, we should remind ourselves that the Xbox One has a GPU equivalent of a 750, so they did the best they could with the hardware they had. The road to a complete recreation of their water is still much longer though. We need to add sea spray particles, a buoyancy simulation, handle underwater rendering, and also simulate the interaction of a boat with the water to create wakes. Each of these things is decently complicated in its own right, but eventually these topics will pop up in the Patreon polls for future videos. For the moment though, I think I'm a little tired of the water. By the way, I'm streaming right now over on Twitch. I'm remastering my Minecraft shaders, so if you have any questions on the video, come ask away. That's all from me. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.